Let's see. Today's lecture is evidence that of the fact of evolution. I wanted to mention there's a really great book called Why Evolution is True by Jerry Coyne. It's just a little paperback. It's, I don't know, it's like $12 or something like that. But I mean, you can have sort of entire GE type courses about evidence of evolution and that kind of stuff. We're going to go over it a little more quickly and talk about some of the major things that lead scientists, at any rate, to say that evolution is a fact, whatever that means. So, as a contrast, we're going to sort of take a pre-Darwinian Western worldview. So a paradigm is a whole way of thinking about the world and how it works, right? So in the Western world, the framework against which Darwin proposed his ideas was a paradigm that involved this Christian thought of life having arisen by special creation, meaning Zhao, like supernatural forces, right, is what special creation means, or God, or whatever that would be, right? Organisms, it was thought, this paradigm held that organisms were found as we find them today. In other words, they don't change, right? What we see now is what was created, was this a central tenet of this paradigm. And what's more, that it was believed to be recent, right? That the biblical story of Genesis could actually be used to trace back and, in a sense, backdate to when this happened. So a whole variety of people who have a literal interpretation of the Bible think that life is on the order of 6,000 years old, right? This guy, Archbishop James Ussher, he actually went through Genesis and went backwards and calculated. His calculations suggested to him that the Earth started in October 4004 BC, right, by doing this kind of calculation, right? So that's a paradigm, a worldview against which Darwin's ideas sort of emerged as a contrast to that kind of thing. So, I said a minute ago, we're going to see what some of these facts are. And I want you to kind of distinguish in your head between facts and inferences, right? Facts are things that you can observe. You can directly verify something about a process or an object or an organism or something like that, right? And inferences are, in a sense, logical constructs based on what you can observe, as well as, you know, a whole variety of different fields of knowledge. Inferences might combine facts from geology and paleontology and life sciences and physics and chemistry, and, you know, gathering together all those different sorts of observable facts as small pieces into a more cohesive, rational, logical explanation about something, right? They're extensions to what is directly observed, right? So the claims of this paradigm of special creation that are potentially observable or verifiable is that species were created independently, that they do not change through time, and that they were created recently, right? And the inference based on those claims is that a supernatural power did this, right? Some God, right? As a contrast, the claims of Darwin and scientists is that species do change through time, and more specifically, that species are related to each other as ancestor-descendant kind of relationship, right? And that's this descent with modification, right? And that this kind of process would take a lot of time. So life on Earth would be ancient. So I mentioned yesterday that Darwin didn't have a realistic time scale based on Lord Kelvin's dating of the Earth to work with, but he knew that for his inferred process to be correct, life on Earth would have had to have been much older than sort of currently accepted timescales. So the process inferred from these claimed and observable facts is that there's descent with modification, species change over time in this ancestor-descendant way, and that it's not random, right? That it is the mechanism that causes organisms to appear to be designed to fit their environment is not a supernatural designer, but is natural selection, eliminating less fit variants that don't have a good fit to the environment, right? So for what we're going to sort of do today is look at evidence for these three potentially observable, verifiable, or refutable things. Are species independent? Are they unchanging? Is life recent, right? Those are things that you could demonstrate in a sort of factual, observable kind of way. So, first part, are they independent or do they show shared ancestry, right? So, as with much of what we've talked about, some of these ideas predate Darwin, right? This idea of shared ancestry and that species change over time was proposed by a variety of anatomists, including a proposal by Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. So the idea that species change over time was not new to Darwin, right? What Darwin provided that was new was a coherent framework for showing an adaptive mechanism for evolution, right? Natural selection. So this, at the time, was based on comparative anatomy. It was anatomists that were looking at the structures of organisms and how they work and comparing their features and noting great similarity between groups. So the idea that we're getting to here is what's in biology is called homology, right? Homology and analogy are different, and they both have sort of English language equivalents, but their meaning in biology is more specific. So homology in a modern biological sense means similar because of descent or similar because of shared ancestry. That's what homology means. Analogy, there's a whole variety of ways things can be analogous. They can be similar, but not because of shared ancestry, right? So in English language, let me compare thee to a summer's day. You're just like a summer's day. You're similar somehow. But in science and biology, what we're saying is that similar selection pressures produce similar kinds of adaptations in unrelated groups of organisms. So, for example, cacti, the cactus family, Cactaceae, is North American in origin, and there's the cacti are almost entirely confined to North America. They don't have leaves, they have big fleshy stems with spines, right? There's a whole set of plants that have similar sorts of adaptations to hot, dry climates and other places of the world. They are not closely related to cacti. They have separately evolved those traits, right? So you would say those are analogous characters that are due to convergent selection pressure to come up with similar ways of meeting the kinds of environmental challenges that are common to those two environments. Okay. So that would be called convergent evolution, if you're keeping track. Let's see. So here's the kind of stuff that the anatomists had to work with. These are the bone structures in the forelimbs of different kinds of vertebrates. And we have a human, horse, bird, bat, seal, and turtle. And the homologous bones are kind of highlighted, right? So you have humerus, radius, ulna, the carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges that you recognize in a arm that is designed primarily for grasping and carrying stuff and texting on telephones and stuff like that, right? Horse limb is designed for walking on the dirt. Birds and bats, flying limbs, seals and turtles, swimming limbs, right? So you have four arms, four limbs, that have really different functions in terms of locomotion and movement, right? But they have the same underlying structure that they're based upon, right? The bone structure of these things is identical, or the metastructure is identical across those groups. Is sort of the proportions of those bones that are different, right? So this kind of similarity is one kind of evidence that similarity would be due to shared ancestry, not due to shared functional design, right? Because if you're going to design a swimming limb or a flying limb from scratch, if you're an engineer making one, you wouldn't have the same underlying structure for those very, very different kinds of functions. Moving through air is a fluid medium, but it's really different than moving through a water fluid medium, right? The similarity of structure, despite really different function, suggests similarity of origin. And this kind of thing is what anatomists notice and they call structural homology, right? So those the humerus, radius, ulna are homologous characters. Then other workers were looking at embryos, the structures of embryos. Louis Agassiz, among others, showed that vertebrate embryos in early development have a lot of common features and common sort of stages that they go through. They look very similar to each other, even when the adult forms look really, really different, like pigs and chickens and humans look really different as adults. As little tiny embryos, they look very, very similar. Early human embryos have gill arch type structures. Your eustachian tube that connects your ear to your throat, that pops when you go up and down mountains, that is derived from the embryonic tissue that was like a gill arch or a gill type structure. You had a tail when you were a wee little one, right? And you have a tail bone now, right? So the structural homologies that you see in adults are due, of course, to development, right? So embryologic and developmental homology is what creates and underlies the structural homologies that you see in adults. Well, that's just a cute picture of you when you were a little kid. There you are with your tail. You're basically indistinguishable from any other vertebrate at that stage. All right, so the reason structural homologies are similar is because they share developmental mechanisms. The reason the developmental mechanisms are the same is because they're based on the same patterns of expression, gene expression, right? So we would expect that genetic homology underlies developmental homology, which is what underlies structural homology, right? And here's one example of genetic homology, right? You've all in Bio 106, 107, or kindergarten, or whenever they teach you this kind of stuff, you know that there's this universal genetic code, which is a really silly name for it because it hasn't been found in any organisms anywhere in the universe other than on Earth, right? So this is a feature of Earth life, not necessarily universal life if there's life somewhere else. And it's not actually really 100% conserved in organisms on Earth. So the translation table for your mitochondrial genome is actually slightly different than the translation table of your nuclear genome. And that's because your mitochondria are derived from bacteria, not the same type of nuclear genome. But there's this unbelievable conservation of genetic information coding in all organisms, even if it's not 100% conservation, right? That's startling genetic homology. It's one of the kinds of evidence that people use to say life, all living things that are here now are probably descended from the same starting point, right? Life on Earth may have started multiple times, but may have gone extinct, right? So that all things that are alive now are descended from the same common ancestor that used some something sort of like this, right? Here's another example of genetic homology in homeodomain eye genes. Now, these are not genes that make eyeballs. These are genes that control where, when, and how eyeballs develop. So you'll notice you have up here, wow, you can't really see that. Now you'll notice up there, you have human, mouse, quail, zebrafish, and fruit fly. You have 4 vertebrates and an insect, right? The insect eyes are really different structurally than vertebrate eyes. As you all know, they have the multifaceted eye. But if you look, the letters up top are 1-letter codes for the amino acids. And if there's a dot, it means that the organism with the dot has the same amino acid encoded as the one above it, right? So what you see is that all of the vertebrates have the same amino acid code for this developmental regulatory gene that controls where, when, and how eyes develop, right? And even though fruit fly eyes have a separate evolutionary origin, or a completely different kind of structure, what helps control their development and expression of fly eye genes is almost entirely the same as what controls the development and expression of vertebrate eye genes. That's pretty amazing, right? Given that those eyes are really different kinds of eyes. Let's see. So, presumably, many of you have aspirations towards medically related kinds of careers. Biomedical researchers work a lot with human trials, but they don't start with human trials, right? You start with mice or chimps or rabbits or something like that. The answer to the question is sort of why. If there was not conservation of genetic and physiological mechanism between mice and fruit flies and pigs and humans, then it would do you absolutely no good to start with those organisms as study systems, right? You couldn't learn anything useful about human physiology and medicine from studying things that are completely independent, separate lineages created by some supernatural being in a completely separate, distinct way, right? There would be no useful conservation of information across those kinds of groups, right? If mice and humans did not share numerous homologies at the genetic and physiological level, then it would be a pointless kind of research program, or extreme luck if something happened to be similar between mice and humans, right? Let's see. So to scientists, this kind of homology suggests shared ancestry, to the point where now, like I mentioned, in biology, the word homology is defined as meaning due to shared ancestry, right? This is sort of related to some things we talked about yesterday. Shared ancestry is distinct in conversation from something evolving from something else, as we were talking about yesterday. So modern humans obviously did not descend from modern great apes, right? We share a common ancestor, as we talked about yesterday, right? And this is, recap of stuff that we talked about yesterday as well. The structure of a phylogenetic tree, again, making the point that what these nodes that are back in time, those represent organisms or populations of organisms that actually existed. Those were, or are, at least in these kinds of diagrams, conceived of as real things that are shared ancestors of descendant taxa, right? Like we talked about yesterday. Okay. Parsimony is, we also talked briefly about yesterday, is also kind of used as a way, when we talked about facts versus inferences, right? Making inferences requires some kind of logical progression and digesting of information. And parsimony is one of these kinds of ideas that's applied to what are better and worse ways of inferring stuff from observable facts. And the idea of parsimony is that simple explanations should be favored over really complicated ones, right? It doesn't mean that the really complicated ones are necessarily wrong, but if you have a choice of a simple explanation without other kinds of confusing extraneous factors involved, then that's the one that you should prefer, right? Horse, zebra, chicken go into a bar. Which is more parsimonious? The horse and the zebra are more closely related to each other than either is to the chicken, or the chicken and the horse are more closely related than either is to the zebra. You tell me. It's not a trick question. Yeah, I mean, it on the face of it, it seems ridiculously obvious in hindsight, I suppose, right? So that's sort of evidence of shared ancestry and homology, and there's tons of these kinds of examples that you could go through. Here's kind of the big question, right? If evolution is change over time, can you demonstrate in a factual sense, do species change over time or not, right? And there's lots of evidence on this point, right? You can get evidence from living species and look at the structures that they have, what are called vestigial traits. You can directly observe species changing over time, like with medium ground finches on the Galapagos Islands. You can look at the fossil record, which could then compare with living species, right, in an ancestor-descendant kind of thing. There's lots of information you can get from fossils about extinction, the law of succession, transitional forms, environmental change, how old the Earth is, right? There's lots and lots of information that you could use to sort of address this kind of question of whether or not species change over time that is factually observable. It does not require any kind of inference. So, vestigial structures. A vestigial structure is a functionless or rudimentary homologue of a structure that has an important function in closely related species. So what is a homologue? Yeah, it's like the noun form of homologous, right? It's a trait that is similar due to shared ancestry, due to being the same kind of thing, right? So here's a bunch of examples. Your tailbone is what's left of your embryonic tail, right? Some people break them when they sit on them too hard. You also have an appendix, which is this outgrowth of your intestine that is functional as a cecum for housing bacteria for digesting plant material in other vertebrate groups. Your wisdom teeth are probably in most humans vestigial traits. They're greatly reduced, but they're sort of carryovers, functionless carryovers of what were adaptive functional traits in ancestors and may still be functional traits in close relatives, right? Goosebumps, getting goosebumps is a way to raise your hair, which increases the ability of your fur to trap warm air next to your skin, right? It can also make you look bigger and scarier if you want to look bigger and scarier, right? This next picture is a salamander that lives its entire life in complete darkness in caves. Right? It has no skin pigment. It's not a weird albino one. It has no skin pigment. Right? That's a derived trait of living in caves. But it lives in complete darkness its whole life and has eyes. The eyes are covered with a skin kind of membrane. They're kind of grown over. They don't see anything. They're useless. They're functionless traits, but they're there, right? So you can say that's an observable fact, and you can make inferences from that would be along the lines of, well, why would a creator create blind salamanders in caves that live in complete dark and yet endow them with these functionless, useless, non-seeing eyes? You can ask that question. Or you could imagine, well, that's evolved from ancestors that had functional eyes, and it's a vestigial trait. It's a relic of past evolutionary history. All right, there are lots of such kinds of examples. They can be structural, like you see. They can also be developmental, of course, and that would make you suspect that you can also have vestigial genes, right? Because genetics underlies development, which underlies structure. So, well, this works in PowerPoint, but it doesn't work on this. Does it make sense to have an embryonic tail, tailbone, embryonic tail, unless your ancestors had tails? If you ask a close relative and you do it in PowerPoint, this chimp pops up and he goes, no, right? But it doesn't work in this, so. There you go. There's your chimp saying no. Vestigial genes are usually called pseudogenes. They're nearly normal genes that are not transcribed to protein. Some people would say that they're part of this large amount of junk DNA, right? What usually happens is if there's duplication of genes in the genome, you get multiple copies of genes, and some of them might further evolve to have a different, more specialized function. For example, hemoglobin, fetal hemoglobin and adult hemoglobin is a little bit different, and fetal hemoglobin has higher oxygen affinity than adult hemoglobin. So that's divergence in these functional copies, duplicate copies of hemoglobin genes. But because you have multiple copies of lots of genes, if you have a mutation in one that makes it, that say is a mutation to a stop codon, it makes that a non-transcribed, completely functionless gene, right? Does that mean it disappears from your genome? No. So your genome is full of things that are called pseudogenes that are non-functional copies of genes that were somewhere else in your genome you would have a copy that does work and performs the normal function, which is why you're still alive, right? That's a very common kind of thing within the genome, right? Wow, could you directly observe species change over time, right? There's some information in the book about AZT susceptibility of HIV viruses, right? And physicians, clinicians have repeatedly observed the population of HIV viruses change within individuals in response to treatment with AZT, right? So you all know about antibiotic resistance and bacteria evolving in response to antibiotic drugs. The same kind of thing happens within populations of HIV viruses within individual humans, and you can trace the change in this population of virus particles over the course of treatment, and observe that species, or that population at least, change over time. And it's sort of, there's enough people that have had AZT treatment that you have sort of replicate experiments of this kind of thing, replicate observations over and over again, right? Hundreds of other examples, right? We talked about finch beaks the other day. I mean, there are large-scale literature reviews in professional journals. There are books written that have, literally hundreds of examples of people observing species change over time in the wild, and not just, kind of artificial selection type stuff or artificial environments, but of populations of organisms evolving in response to some kind of change in the environment. The book has this example of soapberry bugs. So lots of you think any insect is a bug. To entomologists, bugs refers to a specific group of insects, and they all have beaks They use those beaks to pierce food items and suck juices out, right? So soapberry bugs feed on plants and these big seed pods, and the length of their beak appears to be matched to the type of food resource that they use. So these things live in Florida, and their ancestral plant sort of host or food resource was this big thing called a balloon vine fruit. And then in the 1930s or so, this flat-potted golden rain tree fruit was introduced to Florida and became an alternative food resource for these bugs, right? And what this bottom graph shows is that prior to the introduction of this flatter food resource, the distribution of beak lengths was pretty variable, right? But included a lot of long-beaked individuals. And over the course of whatever that is, 70 years or so, you see that the population has changed from an average about like this to an average about like this. So you can see that there's been a decrease in the beak length of these bugs over some 70-ish years, right? There's no way you can get around this as a factual observation that this species has changed over time, right? The inferences you draw about it are, again, separate from observable facts, but you have, indisputable proof that this thing in 1980 is, or populations of it in 1980 are not the same as they were in the early 1900s, right? They change over time. Observable. Let's see, fossils. Fossils are super cool. I put this one in because it's actually a fossil of a bug. It goes with the other one. But insects make great fossils because they have these hard exoskeletons, and so you can preserve really fine structural details of insects that don't always preserve in other things. Usually mammal fossils, you get teeth and skulls and hard kind of things like that, rather than really cool things that look just like a bug. Let's see. Fossils provide, I say here, 3 types of evidence, but really there's a whole variety of evidence that's provided by fossils. They show that extinction happens, right? That not only do individual species change over time, but the entire set of species that is here now is not the same as the set of species that was here in the past, right? There's turnover of species in ecological communities and over long periods of evolutionary time. You have huge, complete or near complete turnover of species through mass extinction events, right? Fossils can also show you species changing over time, right? That's evolution. The age of the Earth, lots of other things. So let's see. Believe it or not, this idea that species went extinct was actually controversial in the early 1800s. Because how do you know you haven't just found it yet, right? It might be out there somewhere. It might be, it's like Sasquatch. It could be out there, right? You just haven't found it, right? You haven't looked hard enough. But in 1812, Cuvier published his analysis of the Irish elk, which is this thing, right? It is an enormous deer with something like 12-foot antler span, and based on its name, guess where it lived? Ireland, the British Isles, northwestern Europe, right? The concentration of scientific thought and people in northwestern Europe, this is not some little fly that might still be kicking around in the Amazon jungle somewhere. It's a huge deer-like elk kind of thing in a place that is well populated, well known to Western scientists. It's not there anymore, right? So that pretty much established that this thing had been here and isn't anymore, right? How is that relevant to the idea that evolution occurs, right? First of all, it shows that species don't persist indefinitely, right? We have this idea that, oh, adaptation and natural selection is amazing, right? It shapes organisms to match their environment. And sometimes we sort of forget that if there's really strong selection pressures, does that necessarily mean populations adapt to them? What if there's not the genetic variation to adapt to some kind of new environmental change? Extinction, right? The fact that things go extinct is suggestive of this whole sort of competition and struggle for life and a failure of adaptation in some sense. I like to say that fossils prove that life isn't set in stone. No one else thinks that's funny. All right. Whatever. Transitional fossils. This is a big deal in the sort of popular non-scientific public's interpretation of the fossil evidence for evolution, whether or not there are transitional forms. Sometimes people call them missing links, right? They're steps that are in between either old fossils and younger fossils, or old fossils and existing organisms, or they're somehow intermediate between two different sets of living organisms. Yeah, there's a question over here.
Since how we define the definition of extinction, then how would we say, like, do people say, okay, dinosaurs were wiped out because of volcanic activity, or could we actually say that something happened and their genes were not suitable for the environment, so they died out? Which one would be the correct answer?
Just to throw another little twist into it, people say that the dinosaurs, if birds are dinosaurs, then dinosaurs didn't go extinct, right? They're still here in the form of birds. But if they're, if you view, it just depends on what level of organization you view organisms. You can look at the whole organism level or the sort of genetic level. And evolutionary biologists tend to look a little bit more at the genetic level, that dinosaurs didn't have the suitable genetic ability to program development and make a living in that super modified environment, whereas other organisms did, right? But that was effectively selection among different species lineages rather than within population selection that we've been talking about so far. But yeah, the species go extinct when all of its individual members die out, right? Because none of them are individually capable of surviving and reproducing in that environment, right? So, all right, so this idea of intermediate forms and sort of missing links is important in the popular imagination, so it's kind of important to clarify what that really means, right? So if we say there's a transitional fossil between a chicken and a hippopotamus, what are you expecting to see in the fossil record? Do you expect to see a creature that is intermediate between chickens and hippopotamuses? A chickopotamus? No. So let's see, what's the next slide here? Just some examples. We'll insert one here. So here's this little mini phylogeny, right? So here's a chicken, here's a hippo, here's a rose bush, right? You have shared ancestors of these different organisms, right? Some kind of say, well, if you find a transitional fossil, a missing link between groups of organisms, in a way, does that really solve your problem? Like if you have a fossil that's right here, and you suddenly find a fossil that looks about like it's right here. Well, does that solve your problem? For a while, you had that much of a missing link, right? Now you find this fossil. What do you have now? You have two missing links. For every fossil you find, you go backwards, right? You instead of having one missing link, now you have two missing links. It gets worse and worse and worse and worse. So you shouldn't think of them like that, as splitting and that they're magically solving your dilemma. The other thing, where would you expect to find a fossil of something? I don't mean in the ground, in the dirt, right? So ideally, the transitional fossil, the Chickopotamus, would be a fossil of that thing right there, right? That common ancestor. What if you find a fossil that is actually of an extinct species that is right here? It is not an ancestor of hippopotamuses or an ancestor of chickens. Is it still a useful, informative, transitional fossil? It's going to have features of hippopotamuses and features of chickens, right? But it's not actually an ancestor of either one. It's still a really useful fossil to find to infer something about that process of evolutionary change, right? So you could find fossils that are, you know, directly on the lineage, right? Those would be great. But of course, they create more gaps in their own sense. But you can also find fossils that are extinct lineages or maybe even predate the split between those two lineages. It'd still be informative about that history of life and the kinds of transitions that organisms went through, right? So you shouldn't expect to find exact, perfect, missing links that are exactly the shared common ancestor. And you certainly, obviously, should not expect to find something that looks as though it's halfway between chickens and hippopotamuses, right? That would be a modern chickopotamus. That's not the kind of evidence that you would rationally go seeking. So let's see. Some cool transitional fossils. No. There we go. Does everyone know what this fossil is? Very, very famous one. Archaeopteryx. Does everyone know what Archaeopteryx? Now you know the name. What is it? So transitional fossil between reptiles and birds. This thing has feathers, which you can maybe kind of see. Oh, stop it. See these up here? Now that I've drawn all over them. Do you see those impressions of feathers? You get the veins of the feathers up there. This thing also has teeth in its jaws, which is like reptiles, but unlike modern birds. It's really hard to see the teeth in even the best pictures in books. This fossil is in a museum in Berlin, Germany, and I was there this last August or September or something like that, and I saw it. And it's really cool. They have it on display. They have the light coming from the side, and then they move where the light goes, so that the little indents and divots sort of highlight the shadows and bring out the relief of the fossil. And you can really see these awesome little teeth in the fossil. So it's really, you know, go to Germany, see it. It's cool. I saw it with my own eyes. I consider it a fact, not a story. Okay. So some of the fundamentalist religious types were really on a tear about the lack of transitional fossils of whales. So once whale fossils became found, they became kind of a famous counterexample of like, oh yeah, there are lots of transitional fossils. So now evolutionary biologists like to make a lot of fossil whales, right? So here's one from Pakistan, about 50 million years old, called Ambulocetus natans. What do you notice about it right away? It's got big old hind legs, right? Ambulocetus means walking whale. If you're ambulatory, you walk. Cetus is whale. Natans means... like the ocean. Yeah, so it's a walking, swimming whale is what the name means. Here's another one. They're from Egypt. There are lots and lots and lots of these. Basilosaurus isis, about 38 million years old. And blown up, you can see it has a pelvis and little tiny legs, and they're not attached to, the pelvic girdle is not attached to the vertebral column. They're kind of floating within the body cavity, so they don't support structural weight, right? This thing couldn't use those legs for propulsion, right? What would you probably call those legs at this stage? They're vestigial traits, right? Here's a modern one, a baleen whale. Like these swim up and down the coast here every year, right? Inside there's no external legs on gray whales and humpbacks and stuff like that, but you have very vestigial bones that are nonetheless recognizable as pelvis and femur, and again, they have no function. They're not attached to the pelvic girdle. They're not doing anything in terms of locomotion, but they're in there, right? That's pretty cool. You have these transitional fossils that link terrestrial motion, walking, with swimming, and also link to modern living organisms, right? Those are really cool kinds of compelling transitional fossils. And you don't have to believe it. You can just go see them. All right. So this also brings up kind of a little interesting side point, which is what in the world are oceanic marine fossils doing in Egypt and Pakistan, which are not, currently under the ocean, right? They're high and dry. So this is nice evidence that the Earth changes, that major features of the sort of global geological arrangement of plates changes, right? Question is, does it change fast or slow, right? So there was a school of thought in the late 1700s that global sorts of change were rapid and catastrophic. Things like the biblical flood would be a rapid catastrophic change in the Earth environment, and just might also handily explain why you get fossils of marine organisms way up on mountains, right? If there was this flood that maybe lifted whales and snails and other kinds of stuff up there. So this hypothesis of catastrophic rapid change was called catastrophism, and was then kind of challenged by geologists who tried to measure the rate of geological change. I wonder why that slide's there. It's out of order. We're going to skip to this one. So James Hutton and Charles Lyell were British geologists that they tried to measure the rates of geological change over time. So rather than being sort of armchair scientists, they're going to actually collect data and measure something as scientists. And so these are the things like, what's the rate of erosion of mountains? How much sediment gets deposited when a river flows into the ocean? Those layers accumulate over time, and you can get, obviously, if there's a big flash flood, a lot more sediment is going to wash down the mountain and get deposited into the ocean basin in that river delta, right? So that seems like a catastrophic sudden event, right? And then there's not a flash flood for a while. And if you kind of aggregate over those little events, you get little bumps in a near continuous kind of slow level of erosion of mountain ranges and the deposition of new sediments and that kind of stuff. So they determined, which won't surprise you, is that the rates of geologic change are, on average, really slow, right? We do have these sudden events, like the Northridge earthquake and stuff like that, but if you look at what is the rate at which the Pacific plate has moved past the North American plate along the San Andreas Fault, that is that overall average rate is a slow, interrupted, but nearly kind of slow, gradual process. The importance of that is it tells you or suggests something about the age of the Earth, right? So if these rates of geologic change are really, really slow, which with interruptions they mostly are, right? And if the rates of change in the past were similar to what you observe today, what Hutton and Lyell measured, right, then you can infer that the amount of time that would be required to build and erode mountain ranges and to lay down sediments of sandstone layers and limestone layers, that would take an awful lot of time, right, based on what you can study about those rates of geologic change, right? That suggests by itself that the Earth must be much, much older than this literalistic interpretation of 6,000 years or so, right? Much older, right? How much older, no one knew, but that it had to be much, much older because these geologic processes were, on average, very, very slow, right? So what early scientists had at their disposal was these rock layers and the animal and plant fossils that are found in them. So this is a kind of schematic of the history of life on Earth that you'll recognize from Bio 106 or kindergarten or whatever it was. And these boundaries between these different named events were based on fossil assemblages, right? So in this time is when you find fish with jaws appearing, and then you have whole sets of fossils that occur in some area and or even around the entire world in different sediments of the same age. So these different kinds of rock layers with their different fossil assemblages were recognizable around the world as different assemblages of organisms changing over time, but no one at that time could say how old they were. But you could say by this layering of fossils that these ones are older than, these ones back here are older than the ones up there, right? So you had relative ages of these different sets of fossils, but you didn't have chronological ages, right? So the current estimates, based on a variety of things, is that Earth is around 4.6 billion years old. Life is about 3.7 billion years, right? And arranged into these things, right? So there's a famous quote that, what would be evidence against evolution? What kind of evidence could you find that would prove that evolution by natural selection as proposed and understood now is false? And the snarky answer was, if you find fossil rabbits in the Precambrian, right? If you look in these rock layers and find fossil rabbits, then there's something seriously wrong with the scientific understanding of how life on Earth evolved. Okay, so these relative dating techniques, right? Layers that are deeper are older. You can get whole rock layers that get inverted by tectonic movements, but generally speaking, where there's sedimentary layers that get piled on top of each other, right? The layers at the bottom are older than the layers on the top, right? If these layers are originally laid flat, right, they can get tilted up and flipped over and stuff like that. Rocks within other rocks. So if you have a sandstone that's put down in layers and it has big cobbles embedded in it, which ones existed first? The cobbles got embedded within the forming sandstone, right? So this is like a layer cake. What's older, the cake or the frosting? The cake is there before you put the frosting on top. If you have walnuts in your cake, they're like the rocks embedded inside, right? The walnuts have to exist before that cake batter becomes cake, right? But if you get cracks in these rocks that get filled and mineralized with other kinds of intrusions, those rocks that fill the cracks and associated fossils that are found in them, right, would be younger, right? Actual ages are based now on radiometric dating because of isotopic decay of a whole variety of different isotopes of different elements, and some decay at rates that make them useful for fairly recent events. Other isotopes decay at rates that are useful for really ancient events. But the idea of this is that these isotopes decay with a characteristic half-life, which is the amount of time it takes for half of the original isotopic element to disappear, right? So here's a graph showing if you have a 100% parent isotope, in one half-life, you're down to 50% of it. In two half-lives, you're down to 25% of that original material, right? So you can use that if you know what the half-life is, you can, and you know how much there is now, you can figure out how old it was when those started to decay, right? You can use that to date not just organisms, but rocks that organisms are found within, right? So that's how scientists now get these chronological time dates on fossils and ancient Earth history. All right, so if we kind of summarize the things that you can observe as a curious person, you can observe homologies at genetic, developmental, and structural levels. There's ringing in my ears again. You can observe the species change, right? Evolution is, I mean, if you take as the definition of evolution, the simplest definition is species change over time, right? It's just undisputable that evolution occurs, right? You can observe that species change over time in a variety of different ways. And life on Earth is old, right? So those observable facts are inconsistent with an inference of recent special creation, right? Instead, what scientists infer from this and a variety of other evidence is this descent with modification process, right? Where what creates the appearance of design in the absence of some supernatural designer is natural selection, weeding out less fit alternatives.